Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight, settle in, dim the lights, and let the day melt away for a bit. We're drifting into one of those deceptively dull historical problems that somehow manage to annoy kings, popes, astronomers, and pretty much everyone who liked their holidays on the right day. It's slow, it's sleepy, and, in the great tradition of human civilization, it's also full of petty arguments, bad math, stubborn monks, and rulers who definitely thought they were smarter than the cosmic machinery of time. So just breathe. Get comfortable, because tonight we're gliding into the long, confusing, slightly ridiculous saga of the Julian versus Gregorian calendars. And yes, this is the kind of story where a simple question, like when is Easter, spirals into centuries of passive-aggressive letters, astronomical and governments arguing about 11 missing days, like they were debating national treasure. Let's ease in. The calendar most of the Western world uses today is the Gregorian calendar, introduced in 1582, but long before that, Europe got by with the Julian calendar, invented in 46 BCE under the direction of Julius Caesar. He was, of course, extremely confident about his mathematical abilities. Caesar acted as if he understood astronomy on a personal level, which he absolutely did not. But he had clever people around him who tried to keep him from breaking the universe. The Julian calendar was meant to simplify timekeeping, bring order, and help Romans stop arguing about when the new year even started. And for a while, it actually worked. Sort of. But the problem with being good enough for now is that eventually the now ends. The Julian calendar had a tiny error, a small mistake, a little microscopic flaw of about 11 minutes per year, which, you'd think, doesn't sound like a big deal. 11 minutes. That's barely enough time for a Roman senator to finish a quick bribe. But when you let those 11 minutes pile up over centuries, things start to slip. And by slip, I mean spring started happening in the middle of winter. Easter wandered around like a lost toddler, and every educated medieval monk kept muttering under his breath that the equinox was fact, not on the day the Julian calendar insisted it was. But let's slow down. Before Gregorian reforms and papal committees with charmingly overconfident astronomers, we need to just float back to the beginning. Ancient Rome, Caesar, and the weird group of astronomers he imported from Alexandria to fix the Roman calendar, which had become such a mess that politicians were literally adding and subtracting months whenever it suited their campaign schedules. Yes, they manipulated the calendar to cheat at elections. Humans have always been very human. The Roman calendar, before Caesar, was so broken that even the Romans, themselves, had given up trying to use it properly. It was lunar-based, but inconsistently so. Some years had extra months added, some didn't. Some months were repeated, sometimes for political reasons. You might go a whole season thinking it was winter when the calendar insisted it was technically still autumn. And honestly, Rome had bigger issues. Like everything else the late Republic was dealing with. Corruption, civil wars, ambitious generals with life-size statues of themselves, and a general feeling that reality was always slightly off. So Julius Caesar, fresh from his time in Egypt and surrounded by people who knew actual astronomy, decided to fix it. He gathered the best scientific minds Alexandria had to offer, and they came up with the Julian calendar. A clean solar calendar, 12 months, a leap day every 4 years. No more random months added by politicians. No more confusion. No more ancient senators adjusting time like they were rearranging furniture. Of course, this was Julius Caesar we're talking about. The man couldn't resist overdoing things. So in order to realign the seasons with the calendar, his first Julian year, 46 BCE, ended up being 445 days long. People just rolled with it. Apparently, when Caesar decides the year has 100 extra days, you just nod and pretend that this is a normal thing to experience. Everyone was probably too tired from decades of political chaos to argue. The Julian calendar then rolled forward, year by year, confident in its mathematical superiority. And, for a while, everything lined up fine. Solstices happened on the expected dates. Festivals matched the seasons. Farmers knew approximately when things were supposed to bloom. The world seemed orderly enough, but that small error in its calculation, the 11-minute drift, slowly nudged everything off course. Like a slightly uneven chair leg that you keep ignoring until one day the entire table tips over. After a century, the drift was noticeable. After several centuries, you could practically hear medieval scholars sighing in frustration every spring. And by the time the Middle Ages rolled around, things were noticeably wrong. Medieval Europe relied heavily on the church calendar, not just for religious life, but for daily life, agriculture, taxes, festivals, and everything in between. And central to the Christian calendar was Easter. Easter needed to stay aligned with the spring equinox. Except the Julian calendar had decided that the equinox was slowly migrating backward in time. The church said the equinox was March 21st, but nature, ever inconvenient, said something entirely different. Slowly but steadily, the true equinox was creeping back to the 11th, then the 10th, then, eventually, the 7th. It must have been fun explaining that to the clergy. You can imagine medieval monks trying to calculate Easter dates using astronomical tables written centuries earlier, all while the sky stubbornly refused to cooperate. So the church kept adjusting things. One pope would write a letter politely asking someone to fix it. Another would create a committee. Another would consider adjusting the leap year rules. But medieval Europe wasn't exactly the place where uniform changes happened easily. Whenever someone proposed calendar reform, half the continent acted like they were asking to rewrite the laws of physics. Still, the problem grew. Year by year, minute by minute. Until the 1500s, when Pope Gregory XIII finally had enough. By his time, the equinox was 10 days off from when the Julian calendar said it should be. And Easter, poor Easter, kept drifting like a confused festival, unsure of where it belonged. Something had to be done. Gregory XIII was many things. Patient with astronomy was not one of them. He set up a committee of mathematicians and clerics who would, in true Renaissance fashion, argue politely, overcomplicate everything, and eventually settle on a new system. The solution was elegant enough. Skip a few days to reset the calendar, then adjust leap year rules so the drift would stop. Simple on paper. Less simple when trying to convince Catholic and Protestant Europe to agree on anything. But we're not there yet. We're still floating gently through the late medieval period, where the calendar problem was widely known but only half-heartedly addressed. People kept writing letters about it. Bishops discussed it. Scholars grumbled. But no one wanted to be the person responsible for rearranging time itself. Too much pressure. Too many opportunities for someone to accuse you of heresy because you dared to say that equinox wasn't on the right day anymore. As the centuries passed, the Julian calendar's imperfections became an ongoing, slowly expanding headache. But, to be fair, nobody in medieval Europe was having an easy time with anything. The calendar drift almost felt like a metaphor. The days didn't quite match the heavens. Seasons were slightly off. Reality felt a little misaligned, which was probably how most peasants felt every day anyway. Still, everyone knew something was wrong. By the time the Renaissance arrived, astronomers were practically waving flags about the issue. They wrote books, charts, tables. Some used math. Some used astrology. Some were very sure they had solved the problem. Others disagreed and said the moon was clearly offended by human arrogance. It was a whole situation, and through all of this, the Julian calendar just kept drifting, calmly, predictably, like a cart with one squeaky wheel that nobody ever fixes. But Pope Gregory's moment is coming. His reform will eventually sweep across Europe, erase 10 days from history, annoy half the population, delight the astronomers, and confuse nearly everyone who had appointments scheduled during that missing week. We'll drift into that soon. But for now, let's float a little longer in the era before the reform, where everyone agreed the Julian calendar was pretty wrong, but somehow also good enough. So let's ease a little further into this drifting world where time itself was slightly wrong, and everyone sort of shrugged about it. Medieval Europe was not exactly a place where precise timing mattered on a daily basis. If you told someone in the 1200s that the equinox was technically off by 10 days, they'd probably blink slowly, adjust their haystack of a cloak, and inform you that they were more worried about whether their roof would survive winter. Daylight hours, feast days, saint days, these were important, but not important enough to spark an astronomical revolution. Still, the Church cared. A lot, because Easter mattered. Easter mattered the way tax season matters to modern governments. Everything hinged on it, and if Easter drifted, other feast days drifted with it, which threw off the entire liturgical year. This made the Church's carefully organized religious rhythm feel about as stable as a goat on ice. This became especially awkward every time a clergyman traveled between regions. Imagine being a bishop from Italy visiting a monastery in England, ready to discuss important matters, only to discover that they were celebrating Easter on a different day because their local calculations didn't quite match the continental ones. You'd have monks staring at each other across the table like, "Is it Easter for you?" No. Should it be? Probably. Do we change anything? Let's just pretend it's fine. The thing is, medieval scholars weren't stupid. They saw the drift. They recorded it. They wrote long, careful letters about it, usually opening with polite phrases like most honorable and venerable personage, which was medieval for "I'm about to tell you something you might not like." The proposed solutions that went nowhere, because implementing them would have required reorganizing every calendar, every feast, and basically every church schedule across Europe. And that felt like too much work. Plus, any suggestion of altering the calendar risked people accusing you of messing with God's design, even though the Church had already acknowledged that the Julian calendar was not exactly divine revelation. It was astrology-flavored bureaucracy at its finest. But still, people resisted change. They always do. Whether it's calendars or phone chargers, as the centuries rolled on, the drift continued. If you could imagine a medieval astronomer sitting at his desk, squinting at old charts, pushing his finger up the bridge of his nose while sighing dramatically, you'd pretty much have the right picture. Most astronomers had to walk a delicate line, acknowledge that the Julian calendar was wrong, but also avoid making anyone angry enough to accuse them of heresy. Meanwhile, the seasons weren't cooperating at all. Spring holidays started creeping toward what felt like late winter. Certain saint days felt out of place. The agricultural cycle looked increasingly mismatched with the liturgical one. Anyone who grew crops likely grumbled about this in their own quiet way. But nobody cared enough to fix the foundation, in a sense. Medieval Europe was like a family living in a house with a crooked front step. Everyone tripped on it occasionally. Everyone complained about it. But nobody wanted to fix it because that's just how the house is. And it stayed like that for hundreds of years. Then the Renaissance arrived, bringing with it people who believed they could fix anything with math. Astronomers, in particular, suddenly had opinions. So many opinions. They studied the skies more closely, made more accurate measurements, and whispered things like the calendar is drifting with the kind of energy that said they wanted someone else to handle it. By the mid-1500s, it was impossible to deny that something had gone deeply wrong with the Julian calendar. The equinox, the sacred, necessary reference point for calculating Easter, was no longer landing where tradition said it did. It had drifted all the way back to March 10th. Theologians found this mildly offensive. Astronomers found it mathematically embarrassing. And Pope Gregory XIII found it annoying enough to actually do something about it. Gregory XIII wasn't exactly an astronomy expert, but he understood the political importance of fixing a calendar that half the world used. So he had an idea that all popes love form a committee. This committee included mathematicians, theologians, and scholars who would later be humorously described as the best minds available, even though they argued constantly and disagreed on nearly everything at first, leading. The charge was a Jesuit mathematician named Christopher Clavius. He had the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can calculate your way out of almost any problem. Clavius threw himself into the project with enthusiasm, gathering astronomical tables, double-checking ancient records, and generally making everyone around him feel like they had never taken a math class in their lives. But even with smarter calculations and clearer measurements, the reform was not easy. One of the first things the committee realized was that fixing the calendar would mean deleting days. That was already going to cause trouble. Imagine telling an entire continent that 10 days would just not happen. People had opinions. People always have opinions about missing days. But before we get into that part, let's settle gently into the intellectual world of the committee. Picture it, rooms full of scholars arguing in thick Latin about the length of the tropical year. Some insisted the Julian calendar had simply mismeasured it. Others argued that the ancient Alexandrian numbers were close enough. And maybe the real problem was that nobody had done the math in 1,000 years. They debated leap years, solar cycles, lunar cycles, the dates of the early church councils, and whether it was sacrilegious to move the equinox. Imagine the tension. Well, Renaissance tension, which was basically quiet disagreement and slightly annoyed eyebrow raisers. Eventually, the committee reached a plan. They decided the calendar needed a reset. 10 days would be removed, and to stop the drift in the future. Leap years would change. Years divisible by 100 would no longer be leap years, unless they were also divisible by 400. This tiny adjustment fixed the Julian problem neatly. The calendar would now stay aligned with the solar year so perfectly that it would only be off by about 1 day every 3,300 years. This was the moment the committee must have felt proud as one can feel while rearranging the mathematical structure of time. But the real challenge was not the math. It was convincing the world to accept that the calendar, the thing people lived their lives by, was going to shift overnight. Gregory XIII signed the order for the reform in 1582. He probably expected applause, maybe admiration. What he got was complicated. The Catholic countries adopted the Gregorian calendar almost immediately. They were used to the Pope telling them what to do. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth all jumped on board. They obediently skipped 10 days, woke up confused, and carried on with life. Other parts of Europe, however, did not share the enthusiasm. Protestant countries viewed the papal reform as some sort of Vatican trick. Maybe it was a plot. Maybe it was a power grab. Maybe the Pope was trying to manipulate time itself for mysterious Catholic reasons. This was the kind of suspicion that could only thrive in the 1500s. England, for example, refused to adopt the reform for nearly 170 years. They didn't switch until 1752. And when they finally did, a rumor circulated that mobs took to the streets, shouting, "Give us back our 11 days." Historians aren't fully sure whether that happened, but it feels like something the English would do, so the legend persists. Still, resistance wasn't purely religious. Some people genuinely didn't like the idea of losing days. It felt unfair. If you had a birthday during the missing 10-day stretch, it simply disappeared. If you had debts due on one of those days, people argued over whether skipping the date also skipped the payment. Clerks and lawyers and accountants across Europe must have sighed heavily during that transition. But despite the chaos, the Gregorian calendar gradually spread, as all practical things do. Catholic nations led the way. Protestant nations followed reluctantly, and Eastern Orthodox nations took their time. Greece didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until the 20th century. By then, the drift between Julian and Gregorian dates had grown to 13 days. You'd think someone would notice the difference when Christmas rolled up in January. We'll drift into that timeline of adoption soon. For now, we're still in the early years of the reform, the moment when Europe found itself divided into two parallel versions of time, one following the Julian calendar, still drifting away from astronomical reality, the other following the Gregorian calendar, neatly aligned with the sun. It must have been weird traveling across borders during that period. One day you walk from a Gregorian using region into a Julian using region and lose 10 days, or gain them. It depended on the direction. It was the closest thing medieval Europe ever got to time travel and all of this. Every missing day, every confused merchant, every grumpy astronomer came from those 11 little minutes the Julian calendar got wrong. Let's drift a little deeper into this long, slow calendar to Gauvois. By the time Gregory XIII rolled out his shiny new system in 1582, Europe found itself in a state of light, time-related confusion. Some countries jumped straight into the new calendar like eager early adopters. Others stood suspiciously at the edge, arms crossed, unwilling to trust anything the Pope suggested. And a few regions just stared at the whole debate with the same energy as someone who missed a meeting and decides to pretend the problem doesn't concern them. But before we wander through the long adoption timeline, let's take a moment to appreciate the world that Gregory was trying to fix. Europe in the late 1500s had become increasingly reliant on precise timing, even if most people didn't think of it that way. Trade was growing. Navigation mattered. Astronomers were discovering that the world didn't revolve around the Earth, which upset all the wrong people. And as exploration expanded, sailors needed accurate ways to track seasons, tides, and long voyages. A drifting calendar might not sink a ship, but it could make navigation unnecessarily chaotic. And chaos wasn't great for empires. So when the clergy, mathematicians, and astronomers finally settled on their complicated but workable fix, many leaders understood the importance of aligning earthly timekeeping with the actual movement of the sun. Still, even good ideas move slowly when they come wrapped in papal seals. Catholic countries made the switch first because, frankly, they didn't have much choice. Spain changed. Portugal changed. Much of Italy changed. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth switched. France switched as well, although the French people mostly grumbled in their very French way about losing days of paid rent. Now, here's where things get a little amusing. When these countries made the switch, the chosen date for the adjustment was October 1582. Specifically, they went from October 4th straight to October 15th. Overnight, no October 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, or 14th. Those days simply did not exist. Imagine going to sleep on October 4th, fully expecting your normal, slightly chaotic Renaissance life, and waking up on the 15th. You'd blink at the date, you'd stare at the calendar, and you'd quietly suspect that someone somewhere had messed up spectacularly. In fact, record keeping from that time is full of tiny confusions. Diaries where people crossed out dates, business ledgers with weird double lines, priests who had to redo feast schedules, bakers who weren't sure how many loaves they baked that week, and tax collectors absolutely insisting that you still owed the full month's taxes, even if the month had been trimmed by 10 days. Because of course they did. But these were Catholic regions. They weren't happy, exactly, but they went along with it. The bigger trouble came from Protestant Europe, which looked at the calendar reform and saw papal fingerprints all over it. And nothing made Protestant countries hesitate harder than the thought of doing something the Pope suggested, even if it was scientifically correct. So the German states split. Some adopted it early, some refused. Some bickered about it at regional councils. It created a patchwork of Gregorian-based and Julian-based territories, all stacked next to each other like a cosmic practical joke. A merchant could travel a few miles and find that the date had jumped by 10 days, or fallen behind. Again, depending on direction. It must have given travelling clerks migraines. England, though England was in a category all its own. Queen Elizabeth I, despite being fully aware that the Julian calendar was a mathematical disaster, had zero interest in embracing a papal reform. The English were deeply committed to not doing what Rome wanted, even if it meant keeping the wrong date for Easter. So England stuck with the Julian calendar for nearly 2 more centuries. Scotland did too, grumbling all the while. When England finally did switch in 1752, the drift between the Julian and Gregorian calendars had grown to 11 days. So the British calendar had to skip from September 2nd straight to September 14th. 11 whole days vanished. And this is where the famous and probably exaggerated "give us back our 11 days" story comes from. It's one of those historical anecdotes that may or may not have happened, but fits the mood so perfectly that historians let it live rent-free anyway. In reality, The complaints were more mundane: wages, rent, contracts. People wanted to know if they'd still get paid for the missing days. Landlords insisted the full month's payment was due. Debtors wondered if skipping 11 days meant their repayment deadlines also skipped. Spoiler, they didn't. Lawyers probably had the time of their lives, but England finally aligned with the rest of Western Europe. Or most of it, anyway. Eastern Europe remained staunchly Julian for a while longer. The Orthodox Church, quite reasonably, didn't want a Catholic pope dictating the structure of its calendar, so they kept their Julian dates, even as the drift continued. A few countries eventually switched their civil calendars for practical reasons, but many Orthodox churches still use the Julian system for religious observances to this day, which is why some Orthodox Christians celebrate Christmas in January. It's not that they're late. They're just using a different version of time. Now, let's settle back into the deeper layers of the debate. Because while the calendar reform seems like a straightforward correction when explained in modern terms, it wasn't simply about astronomy. It was tied to identity, authority, tradition, and a surprising amount of cultural pride. For example, when Poland adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1582, it was partially because it aligned them with Rome, but some Polish nobles insisted that their astronomers had already understood the Julian drift centuries earlier and could have fixed it themselves if they'd felt like it, which is adorably nationalistic. Germany's scattered adoption was a political puzzle of its own. Lutheran areas argued that the reform made mathematical sense, but still refused to implement it for a while because, well, it came from a pope. They eventually caved when navigation and trade became too messy to ignore. Nothing persuades a merchant to adopt a new calendar like losing money on paperwork mistakes. Russia, interestingly, stayed Julian the longest among major powers. The Russian Empire didn't switch to the Gregorian calendar until 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Tsarist government had debated it multiple times, but tradition always won. When the Soviet government finally forced a change, many religious groups refused to follow it, insisting the Gregorian calendar was a Western, decadent invention. They preferred their drift. It was their drift. By then, the Julian calendar had fallen 13 days behind. So if a Russian peasant in 1917 told you it was January 10th, the rest of the world would say it was January 23rd. This explains why some historical events appear to have two dates, Old-style Julian and New-style Gregorian. For example, the October Revolution, famously named for happening in October, actually took place in November, according to the Gregorian calendar. But the November Revolution just doesn't have the same ring. Meanwhile, one of the more quietly amusing things about the Gregorian reform is how precise it was. The new leap year system, skipping centuries unless divisible by 400, works astonishingly well. It keeps the calendar aligned with the solar year with tiny, almost imperceptible drift. This means the Gregorian calendar is far more accurate than the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, or Rome ever achieved, and certainly more accurate than Julius Caesar had any reason to expect from his borrowed Alexandrian math. And yet, even after the reform proved correct, people still resisted it. Some out of habit, some out of fear, some because they believed controlling time was equivalent to controlling faith, and some simply because they didn't want to do all the math involved in adjusting their paperwork. While all this resistance brewed, scholars in universities across Europe quietly studied the Gregorian calculations and agreed they were correct. After all, astronomers had been refining their measurements for centuries, And this new system lined up beautifully with their observations. So even if some countries hesitated politically, scientifically, the Gregorian calendar became the gold standard, almost immediately. But there's another angle to this whole story, one we haven't floated into yet. And that's the quiet human perspective. Because when you zoom in, the calendar debate wasn't just church councils and national policies. It was individuals encountering the missing days and having to adjust their lived experience. Imagine someone with a birthday on October 10th, 1582. That day simply didn't exist. They'd have to pick another day. Or imagine someone who died during those missing 10 days. Their death date might have been recorded as something that technically never happened. Families must have had some surreal conversations. And then there were farmers, who already trusted their own observations over anything written on a page. They watched the sun, the weather, and the seasons. So when the Gregorian reform suddenly realigned the calendar with the actual sky, farmers probably shrugged and said, finally. As the years rolled on, the Gregorian calendar proved its value. Science grew more precise. Navigation improved. Astronomy advanced. Global trade expanded. And the need for a unified calendar across nations became obvious. By the 17th century, even Protestant astronomers admitted privately that Gregory's fix was correct. Even if they didn't want to acknowledge the Pope's involvement, time, as it tends to do, moved on by the 18th century. The Gregorian calendar was no longer a political issue. It was simply the practical choice, except, of course, for the handful of places that clung to the old Julian system out of tradition. There's always a few. Let's settle in for the last stretch of this long, gentle drift through the centuries of calendar confusion. We've wandered through ancient Rome, watched medieval monks sigh at the drifting equinox, and followed Renaissance scholars as they tried to tidy up the mess Julius Caesar left behind. Now we can float through the aftershocks of the reform, when the dust settled and the world gradually adjusted to living with one of the most successful pieces of bureaucratic engineering in history. Once the Gregorian calendar began spreading across Europe, something interesting happened. Scientists everywhere noticed how much easier their work became. Astronomers no longer had to keep notes about calendar drift corrections in the margins. They could track celestial events with confidence. Observatories could compare their numbers without arguing about whether the sky was wrong or the date was. It was the sort of quiet improvement that doesn't get celebrated, but genuinely changes daily life. As the 1600s rolled on, accuracy mattered more than ever. Telescopes improved, measurements sharpened. Astronomy was evolving so quickly that a drifting calendar would have been unbearable. The Gregorian system didn't just tidy up feast days. It saved early modern science from a lifetime of headaches. Still, the reform didn't magically erase cultural habits. Local traditions clung to their old feast dates. Parish priests used whatever tables they felt comfortable with. Some villages celebrated feast days based on the weather rather than the calendar, which, honestly, might have been the most practical method of all. And then there was the charming issue of record keeping. The more countries adopted the Gregorian calendar, the more everyone had to clarify what date they meant. Lawyers would write old-style OS or new-style NS in contracts. Historians developed a habit of using double dating for events in January, February, and March. It was messy, but functional. People adapted because they always do. Meanwhile, scholars kept studying calendar systems from other civilizations. Many were impressed by older cultures that had mastered solar accuracy in ways Europe never had. The ancient Egyptians, for example, had tracked the rising of Sirius and figured out the solar year with remarkable precision. The Maya created complicated cycles that modern mathematicians still study with awe. Even the Persians had developed calendars with accuracy similar to the Gregorian long before Gregory XIII began worrying about the equinox. One could almost sense a collective Renaissance embarrassment. Europe thought it had reinvented timekeeping, only to discover that other civilizations had already done a better job centuries earlier. But pride is flexible. The Gregorian system slowly earned a reputation as the best balance of accuracy and simplicity, even if it wasn't the most mathematically perfect system ever made. It was just practical enough, and convenience wins every time. As more countries adopted the Gregorian calendar, global life became easier. Shipping logs lined up. Diplomatic letters didn't need date translations. Universities could coordinate observations. International fairs didn't accidentally start a week apart because two nations disagreed on what day it was. By the 1700s, even the most stubborn states started realizing that sticking with the Julian calendar was like refusing to upgrade a piece of software everyone else used. You could hold on to your old version if you wanted, but eventually it became more trouble than it was worth. Britain's adoption in 1752 smoothed trade with continental Europe. Sweden, in an endearingly chaotic move, tried to transition slowly by skipping certain leap years, then changed their mind and went back to the Julian calendar, then ultimately switched to the Gregorian. Their calendar during those years looked like a notebook that had been erased and rewritten 3 times. But they eventually sorted it out. By the 1800s, the Gregorian calendar was the global standard for international diplomacy, science, and commerce. Even nations that disliked its Catholic origins eventually accepted it for practical reasons. There's only so long you can insist the date is something else when every ship captain, merchant, and astronomer is using a different system. But some communities held onto the Julian calendar for cultural and religious reasons. And honestly, that's understandable. Calendars aren't just instruments of time. They embed tradition. They tell people when to celebrate, when to mourn, and when to gather. So even when a more accurate system emerges, the emotional connection to the old one doesn't disappear. The Orthodox churches, for example, continued celebrating certain feasts based on the Julian system. This is why some Orthodox Christmas celebrations happen in early January. It isn't because of delay or confusion. It's simply loyalty to a tradition that mattered deeply to them. Accuracy wasn't the point. Continuity was. As for Russia, its famously late switch in 1918 tells you everything about how strong tradition can be. The Bolsheviks adopted the Gregorian calendar because they wanted to modernize quickly. The old system was bourgeois, they said, and a scientific society needed scientific timekeeping. But ordinary people were split. Some followed the new dates. Some refused. The argument spilled into newspapers, village meetings, and family conversations. And during all this, the Julian calendar kept drifting like a stubborn old clock that nobody wanted to fix. Today it's off by 13 days. In 2100, it will drift to 14 days. Eventually, it will drift more. The Julian year is simply too long. Its tiny mathematical mistake just keeps adding up, slowly, quietly, steadily yet. The Gregorian calendar isn't perfect either. It drifts too, but so faintly that it takes millennia to notice. If humans are still around in a few thousand years, someone will probably tweak it again. Another committee will meet. Astronomers will argue politely. and the world will eventually lose another handful of days. Hopefully not during tax week. But what makes the story of these two calendars so soothing is how human it all is. The mistakes, the pride, the reluctant compromises, the monks scribbling notes while muttering about equinoxes, the kings refusing to adopt a papal reform out of pure political stubbornness, the astronomers arguing over decimal points, the peasants who just wanted to know when to plant barley. Timekeeping, which should be cold and mathematical, ended up shaped by culture, faith, ego, geography, and convenience. The sun didn't drift. The seasons didn't shift. The earth kept spinning exactly as it always had. Humans were the ones who struggled to keep up, and through it all, the debate over the Julian and Gregorian calendars wasn't a dramatic clash of ideas. It wasn't some world-shaping battle. It was a long, slow, gentle disagreement over minutes. Minutes that turned into hours, then days, then weeks. Minutes that shaped feast days, navigation charts, and eventually world history. If there's a moral here at all, it might be this. Even the smallest errors grow into large problems when you ignore them for long enough. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Sometimes you just need to get a few mathematicians in a room and let them argue until the numbers line up. Either way, the world finally settled into the Gregorian rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. It still works. And most people barely think about the centuries of quiet debate. Behind every date, they write as we close out this long drift through the history of the calendars. Just imagine the many generations who lived their entire lives under the Julian system, never knowing their equinoxes were a little off. Imagine the committee members who spent months debating the proper leap year formula. Imagine the sailors relieved to have consistent dates in their logs at last. And imagine all the people who lost 10 days in 1582, shrugged, and went back to their chores. Time kept moving. It always does. We're entering the era when the Gregorian calendar existed, but the Julian calendar refused to die. Let's settle into that. By the time the 1600s rolled around, Europe had become a patchwork of calendars. Picture a quilt that someone stitched together while half asleep. Catholic countries had moved to the Gregorian system and were very proud of themselves. Protestant regions were suspicious of anything with a papal signature and kept the Julian calendar out of sheer principle. Orthodox countries continued using the Julian calendar because tradition was tradition, and that was that. And the result? A continent where people could stand a few miles apart yet live on different dates. This made everything complicated. Diplomacy became a slow, polite nightmare. Ambassadors had to specify which calendar they were using in their letters because nobody wanted to accidentally start a war on the wrong day. Treaties sometimes listed to dates. Birth records had double entries. Merchants who traveled between two systems had to adjust their ledgers, like cosmopolitan time travelers. And then there were the astronomers, poor, exhausted astronomers, who had to keep track of what the skies were doing, while also remembering which earthly region believed it was Thursday and which insisted it was next Monday. One of the quietly funny things about this period is how many scholars tried to create universal timekeeping solutions that would magically solve everything. Some tried to revive old Egyptian methods. Others insisted the world should have one continuous count of days starting from creation. Others wanted to adopt complicated systems with cycles and epicycles, and more leap rules than a medieval dance manual. None of these ideas went anywhere. People wanted a calendar that made sense, but not a calendar that took an hour to explain. The Gregorian calendar wasn't perfect, but it was simple enough that normal people could use it without looking like they were trying to decode ancient runes. But even with its practicality, it took centuries for the Gregorian calendar to become the standard. And a big reason was that calendars were tied to identity. A calendar wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, a reminder of who you were, what you believed, whom you followed, and where your loyalties lay. So when the Pope introduced a new calendar, Protestant countries reacted exactly as you'd expect, by deciding the old one suddenly looked perfectly fine. It didn't matter that the Julian calendar was technically wrong. It was now symbolically right. And religious politics always beats math. During the 1600s and 1700s, you could find the oddest combinations. A Protestant merchant might privately use Gregorian dates in his business papers because they made international trade easier, but still followed Julian holidays at church because that was tradition. A scientist could track planetary motion using Gregorian dates, but still date his publications in the Julian system because that was what his university used. Families kept double-entry diaries. Scholars wrote letters with 2 dates on top. It must have been exhausting, and yet people adjusted. Humans are good at quietly dealing with nonsense. As Europe expanded globally, the calendar situation grew even more tangled. Missionaries in Asia would send letters using Gregorian dates, while some colonial administrators stuck to Julian dates because that's what their home governments used. Meanwhile, local cultures across Africa, Asia, and the Americas had their own traditional calendars. Many of them far more closely linked to seasonal cycles than anything Europe had invented. For example, in parts of India, different regions relied on solar or lunar calendars, depending on local custom. In China, the traditional lunar-solar calendar continued to dictate festivals and agricultural timing, while the imperial government experimented with Western timekeeping for bureaucracy. Japan briefly considered the Gregorian calendar in the 1600s, but only officially adopted it centuries later. The Islamic world used the Hijri lunar calendar for religious purposes while using Julian or Gregorian systems for administration depending on the region. It wasn't just 2 calendars anymore. It was dozens, layered in complicated ways. And this created a strange moment in world history, a period when different cultures genuinely lived in different versions of time. The Gregorian calendar slowly spread where trade demanded it. Commerce has a sneaky way of convincing people to accept practical solutions. If your foreign partners used a certain date system, you eventually had to use it too. Otherwise, your contracts became soup by the 1700s. European powers that hadn't adopted the Gregorian calendar began to feel the pressure. England's merchants complained that they kept messing up trade schedules because their dates didn't match those of Dutch and French traders. Scientists grumbled that they couldn't compare observations without extra math. Diplomats quietly admitted that sometimes they weren't entirely sure which day a treaty had taken effect because the signatures were dated differently. And so, even stubborn countries began to reconsider. England's switch in 1752 is the famous one. But it wasn't the only dramatic changeover. Sweden's attempted transition in the early 1700s was especially Their government decided to slowly move to the Gregorian calendar by skipping certain leap years. Then they forgot. Then they got confused. Then they skipped a day they weren't supposed to. Then they panicked, realized their calendar was now completely off, and, very gracefully, went back to the Julian calendar for a while. Finally, in 1753, they gave up on the slow approach and dropped 11 days in one go. It was the chronological equivalent of tripping down the stairs, standing up and pretending everything was fine. The Orthodox world held out longer. Russia embraced the Julian calendar with the determination of someone clinging to a family heirloom, even as it became clear that everyone else had moved on. The Tsarist government discussed switching several times, but tradition and church resistance kept winning. It wasn't until 1918, after the fall of the monarchy, that the new Soviet government made the change. And even then, the Orthodox Church kept the Julian calendar for religious dates. That's why, even today, you still get Orthodox Christmas in January. It's not confusion. It's a quiet act of continuity. While all this adoption drama unfolded, a quieter transformation was happening in the world of science. As more countries accepted the Gregorian calendar, scientific collaboration became easier. Astronomers could share data without adding conversion notes. Navigation tables became more accurate. Observatories kept consistent logs. And the idea of international scientific time slowly emerged. Calendars may seem trivial, but they shape everything. Agriculture, trade, religion, science, politics, daily routines. And because timekeeping sits at the center of all these things, humans tend to attach pride to it, which brings us to one of the more curious legacies of the Julian-Gregorian debate: the way it shaped people's understanding of being modern. By the 1800s, adopting the Gregorian calendar wasn't just about being correct. It was a statement, a symbol that a nation wanted to participate in the global world, wanted to be aligned with science, wanted to join international trade networks. The Gregorian calendar became a quiet badge of modernity. Even countries outside the Western world saw the value in switching. Japan adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1873 as part of the Meiji reforms, which aimed to rapidly modernize the nation. Egypt followed in the 1800s for administrative purposes, even though the Coptic Church kept the ancient Alexandrian calendar for religious life. Many Middle Eastern and African regions adopted multiple calendar systems at once, one for religion, one for international trade, one for local culture. It sounds confusing, but people handled it gracefully. Meanwhile, in Europe, most of the calendar drama faded into a kind of sleepy acceptance. By the late 19th century, nearly everyone used the Gregorian calendar for civil life. The Julian calendar had slowly become a niche relic, kept alive mostly in religious contexts. But even then, its days were numbered, literally drifting further away from the seasons each year. So here we are, centuries after Julius Caesar created a calendar that seemed brilliant at the time, but slowly unraveled like a poorly sewn hem. And centuries after Gregory XIII tried to fix the unraveling with a committee of patient mathematicians and one very persistent Jesuit. The result is the system you use every day without thinking about it. The date you write, the holidays you schedule, the tax deadlines you dread, the birthdays you forget until your phone reminds you. This whole structure grew out of a long debate that nobody wanted to deal with, but everyone eventually had to address. And we're not done. Not even close. Let's drift a little deeper into this strange era when the world was technically living in the same century but emotionally living in different centuries. Timekeeping in the 1600s and 1700s was a soft kind of chaos. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly confusing in a way that made everyone sigh more often than usual, because once you had to parallel calendars running across Europe, every practical detail in life got just a little more irritating. It wasn't disastrous. It wasn't exciting. It was just mildly inconvenient, and mild inconvenience, stretched across generations, becomes its own kind of historical mood. One of the most overlooked complications was travel. A merchant leaving a Gregorian country like France and heading into a Julian country like England had to mentally adjust his schedule the way modern travelers adjust for jet lag. Except this wasn't my phone, says one thing. The wall clock says another. This was my hometown, says it's the 15th. But the place I'm visiting insists it's the 4th. If you weren't careful, you could literally arrive for a meeting 10 days early or late, depending on who was counting. Diplomats had it even worse. Their jobs depended on timing. Treaties required specific dates. Negotiations had schedules. And nothing kills the vibe of a diplomatic meeting faster than discovering that one side thinks it's Tuesday and the other is already halfway through the next week. Historians often talk about major political conflicts, alliances, and wars from this era, but rarely mention how much extra patience everyone needed just to keep track of what day it was. You can almost picture European diplomats sitting around a table, rubbing their temples, murmuring things like, "Yes, we will sign your treaty, but could someone please explain why your dating system believes it's still last week?" But while the date mismatch was annoying, it wasn't the only headache. The real trouble came from Easter. Yes, Easter again. The holiday that absolutely refused to mind its own business. Because while the Gregorian calendar corrected the drift and realigned Easter with the spring equinox, the Julian calendar just kept wandering off, which meant the two calendars didn't just disagree on the date. They disagreed on the whole rhythm of the religious year. A Catholic Easter might fall on one Sunday, while a Protestant or Orthodox Easter, calculated using the Julian system, could be one or even several weeks later. In some mixed regions, you could end up with families, neighbors, or entire towns celebrating Easter at completely different times. So imagine two villages separated by a river. On the Gregorian side, Easter is happening today. Bells are ringing. People are dressed in their nicest clothes. Feast tables are set. Meanwhile, on the Julian side, it's just an ordinary Sunday. Chickens are being fed. Laundry is being hung. Everyone is minding their business. 2 weeks later, the situation flips. It must have been surreal, and yet, it also created an unintentional rhythm to life, almost like two parallel seasons drifting side by side. But as scientific pressure increased, especially in the 1700s, the Gregorian system slowly became impossible to ignore. Astronomers from France, Italy, and the German states kept publishing observations based on Gregorian dates. Meanwhile, English scientists, famously stubborn, insisted on using old-style dates, but privately grumbled about the extra conversions they had to do. Isaac Newton, for instance, did his calculations using the Julian calendar because that was the English system. Yet when he corresponded with European scholars, he had to convert his own dates to the Gregorian system. Imagine being one of the smartest men in history and still needing a little mental math every time you wrote the date. It's oddly comforting while scientists navigated the dual calendar world. Normal people simply moved on with their lives. Births, weddings, funerals, everything got recorded according to whichever calendar the local church or government used. This is why genealogists today spend half their time muttering about old-style dates under their breath like a curse. Now, if the calendar issue weren't enough, Europe was also dealing with new scientific debates. The 1600s and 1700s were full of discoveries, theories, and the occasional ego-driven feud. But even as the scientific world shifted dramatically, heliocentrism, gravity, optics, the calendar debate remained stubbornly slow. Part of the hesitation came from cultural conservatism. Changing the calendar meant changing people's sense of rhythm. Holidays felt tied to specific dates, even if those dates had drifted away from their original seasonal meaning centuries earlier. The Julian calendar might have been wrong, but it was familiar, and familiarity tends to win until someone forces the issue. That's exactly what happened in the Orthodox world. Russia's refusal to adopt the Gregorian calendar eventually created a sort of temporal bubble. While Western Europe marched into the so-called modern age with aligned dates and tidy astronomical tables, Russia held on to a drifting system that slowly pulled further away from reality. By the 1800s, the Julian calendar was 12 days behind. By 1900, it became 13 days. That might not sound like much, but imagine celebrating Christmas almost 2 weeks after everyone else, or writing a letter to France only to realize your dates looked like they came from an alternate universe. Inside Russia, the calendar became part of national identity, something distinctly theirs, something untouched by Western influence, something that symbolized tradition in a rapidly changing world. So even when reform-minded advisors suggested switching to the Gregorian calendar in the 1800s, Tsars repeatedly hesitated. They didn't want to be the rulers who tampered with time. Then came the 1917 revolutions, which toppled the monarchy and brought in a government that was aggressively modern, or at least wanted to look that way. The Bolsheviks adopted the Gregorian calendar almost immediately in 1918. They likely saw it as a symbolic break from the old order, a way to align with global standards, a way to appear rational, scientific, and forward-thinking. But even after the civil calendar changed, the Russian Orthodox Church held on to the Julian system, and still does for several feasts, which means that even today, in the 21st century, echoes of this centuries-long debate remain alive. But before we drift too far ahead, let's float back to another interesting point, the idea that calendar reform ended with Gregory XIII. It didn't, not even close. After the Gregorian calendar spread across Europe, scholars began proposing additional improvements. Some wanted to adjust the leap year rules further. Others wanted to add leap weeks instead of leap days. Some suggested New Year structures. There were people proposing calendars with 13 months, calendars with 30-day months only, calendars with standardized quarters, and one calendar that looked suspiciously like the designer had put far too much trust in geometry. None of these systems took off. The world had finally settled into something that worked well enough. And well enough was, after centuries of drifting dates and political arguments, a huge improvement. Besides, changing the world's calendar twice in one millennium is already more than enough chaos. Still, the rest of the world didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar in perfect unison. Japan switched in 1873. Egypt reformed its civil calendar in stages. Many African regions kept local calendars for festivals while using the Gregorian system for official documents. China adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1912 for government use, though traditional lunar festivals remained deeply rooted in cultural life. So by the 20th century, the world had formed a kind of dual structure, Gregorian for official business, traditional calendars for cultural life. And that's still true today. Lunar New Year, Islamic holidays, Jewish holidays, Ethiopian timekeeping, and many indigenous systems all coexist with this global standard. But the story isn't just about regulations and observatories. It's also about how the average person experienced time. For example, when England switched in 1752, there were families who literally had their birthday moved. A child born on September 6, 1749, suddenly found that the country had jumped forward, past their birthday in 1752. Some families celebrated on the old date. Some moved to the new, and some just shrugged and picked whichever one was easier to remember. Imagine being an accountant that year, or a landlord, or someone planning a wedding, or imagine being a person who died during the skipped days in 1582. Your official date might be recorded as something that technically didn't exist. If ghosts kept diaries, that would probably bother them. All of this gives the debate a very human shape. Quiet confusion, slow adjustments, gentle resistance, lots of shrugging, centuries of "we'll get around to it eventually." And as the 1700s closed and the 1800s began, the world finally started to converge on one civil calendar. Though the Julian system continued drifting peacefully in the background like an old clock left running out of nostalgia, where the calendar debate edges toward its long, quiet conclusion. By now, the Gregorian system was spreading across the world like a polite guest who keeps knocking until everyone eventually lets them in. But the transition was neither fast nor simple. The shift wasn't a single moment. It was a centuries-long process packed with small adjustments, reluctant compromises, and a lot of people deciding that yes, maybe it's finally time to agree on what day it is. As the 1800s unfolded, countries outside Europe began encountering the Gregorian system more often through trade, diplomacy, and the slow web of global connections. And, unsurprisingly, many governments realized that having one unified calendar made international coordination significantly easier. Japan is a good example. During the Meiji Restoration, when the government was modernizing at breathtaking speed, officials realized that sticking to the old lunar-based calendar was going to make international negotiations unnecessarily confusing. So, in 1873, they adopted the Gregorian calendar for civil use. It wasn't because they adored Western astronomy. It was simply practical. Japanese society still kept many traditional festival dates, but the official paperwork snapped into alignment with global standards. China's transition had its own twists. The Chinese imperial court clung to its traditional lunar calendar for centuries because it symbolized dynastic authority. Emperors were expected to maintain harmony between heaven and earth, and altering the calendar felt like rewriting cosmic law. So when the Republic of China was founded in 1912, adopting the Gregorian calendar became a symbolic break from imperial tradition. But even then, cultural life continued to follow traditional festivals. The Lunar New Year remained a cornerstone of social rhythm. It still is. Egypt also made its adjustments. The civil administration gradually shifted to Gregorian-style dates in the 1800s and early 1900s, while the Coptic Orthodox Church continued using the ancient Alexandrian calendar for its religious life, one of the oldest continuous calendar traditions on Earth. Again, the civil calendar became practical infrastructure, while the religious one preserved cultural memory. This duality, official time versus cultural time, became one of the defining features of the modern era. The Gregorian calendar unified global logistics, but it didn't erase the world's older timekeeping systems. Instead, they layered themselves into daily life, coexisting in gentle harmony. An Ethiopian Christian might observe holidays using the Ethiopian calendar while filing tax forms in Gregorian dates. A Jewish community might use the Hebrew calendar for rituals, but run their businesses using Gregorian time. Muslims might follow the Hijri calendar for religious observances while scheduling meetings on Gregorian dates. And really, this peaceful coexistence is the natural end of the Gregorian-Julian debate. A world where more than one way of telling time can sit quietly side by side, without anyone insisting that the other is wrong. But before the 20th century reached this balance, there were still a few final holdouts to convert. Greece, for example, didn't adopt the Gregorian civil calendar until 1923. By that point, the Julian calendar was 13 days off, which was enough to make festivals feel oddly detached from the seasons. The Greek Orthodox Church, however, kept the old calendar for religious purposes for many years. This created an entire generation that lived with a split rhythm. Official dates shifting forward, holy days following older patterns, and, in Russia, as we drifted through earlier, the switch came in the wake of revolution. The Bolsheviks weren't interested in preserving symbols of the old monarchy, so adopting the Gregorian calendar in 1918 was an easy political decision for them. What wasn't easy was convincing everyone else. Newspapers printed conversion tables. Schools held special sessions. Factories had to coordinate work schedules. And the Orthodox Church kept to the Julian system, which meant that Christmas and Easter continued to drift away from their earlier seasonal anchors. But even after these late transitions, the Julian calendar remained alive in pockets. Certain religious communities kept using Julian dates simply because they were familiar. Some cultural rituals remained tied to the old rhythm. And, in a few cases, people simply didn't see the point of abandoning a calendar their ancestors had used for centuries. Even today, you'll still find the Julian calendar in small corners of life. Some Orthodox churches keep it for feast days. Certain local traditions in Eastern Europe still follow dates that quietly drift by another day every few centuries. It isn't a problem. It's just a reminder of how long the debate has lasted, and how gentle its ending has been, because the calendar issue never exploded into anything dramatic. It wasn't a sudden revolution. It wasn't a moment of grand revelation. It was a slow, sleepy negotiation spread across 500 years. A debate that stretched like a quiet breeze through courts, monasteries, scientific societies, and rural villages. A disagreement over minutes that became weeks, then days, then full seasons. And now we come to one of the subtler consequences of this long transition, how it changed people's relationship with time itself. Before standardized calendars, time was local. Seasons were local. People lived by what they saw. But the Gregorian calendar helped push the world toward uniformity. Global trade schedules, international science collaborations, later, the industrial era's strict working hours. Eventually, time zones, coordinated universal time, the atomic clock. It's strange to think about it. But the same debate that once made monks argue about the equinox now connects satellites, flight schedules, bank transfers, and your phone's clock. The Gregorian system didn't create global timekeeping on its own, but it laid the foundation. Without it, coordinating anything on a global scale would have involved far more confusion and a lot more headaches. But let's drift back to the human level, because that's where the story really lives. Imagine an elderly man in 1752 England grumbling that September felt shorter than it ought to. Or a Greek villager in 1923 checking 2 calendars on the wall, one for work, one for church. Or a Russian family in the early 1900s celebrating 2 different versions of New Year, because tradition and modernity couldn't quite agree on which one was correct. Even today, people raised in Orthodox traditions sometimes casually refer to old calendar Christmas, as if it's perfectly normal to celebrate a winter holiday in January. And to them, it is. These little lived moments are what make the calendar debate more than a technical adjustment. It wasn't just a correction to a piece of paperwork. It was an adjustment to how millions of ordinary people experienced the passing of the year. It shaped when they celebrated birthdays, mourned loved ones, planted crops, paid rent, got married, and marked milestones, and all because Julius Caesar's calendar was off by 11 minutes per year. It's almost amusing how small the original mistake was, and how large the consequences became. But that's history. Big shifts often come from tiny errors that accumulate slowly, becoming harder to ignore. By the time the world reached the mid-20th century, the Gregorian calendar had become so universal that most of the debate felt antique. Countries that hadn't switched for civil life eventually did so to align with international expectations. The Julian calendar faded into quiet corners of religious practice, and the idea of changing the world's calendar again became something only mathematics, enthusiasts, and the occasional eccentric professor talked about. Not that proposals disappeared. Across the 1900s, various calendar reform plans popped up. Some designs tried to make each month uniform. Others wanted for perfect quarters. Some ideas scrapped the 7-day week entirely, which was never going to win hearts. The world listened politely and moved on. After half a millennium of calendar confusion, nobody had the energy for another overhaul, so the Gregorian calendar remained, flawed in tiny ways, elegant enough, familiar to billions, and deeply stitched into the structure of modern life. Settle back again, loosen your jaw a little, take a slow breath, and let the day slide off your shoulders. Tonight we're heading deeper into the soft, dusty corners of calendar history. Yes, we're still here. Yes, we're still talking about the Gregorian and Julian calendars. And no, this debate hasn't gotten any less sleepy over the centuries. But that's exactly why it works so well for bedtime, where we drift through the aftermath of the transition, those long, strangely peaceful centuries after the Gregorian calendar became the civil standard, but still had to coexist with older systems, traditional rhythms, and communities who were completely unimpressed by the Pope's mathematical ambitions, because even after the world mostly adopted the Gregorian calendar, the story didn't end. It just changed shape. The conflict softened, the politics faded, and the argument over the correct date turned into something quieter and more cultural, almost nostalgic, like an old disagreement between relatives that no one remembers clearly, but everyone agrees to keep alive out of habit. So let's slip gently into this era. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the practical debate over the calendars was essentially over. Most governments had accepted the Gregorian system for civil life. Scientists were using it. Global trade depended on it, and anyone involved in international diplomacy simply had to get on board. But traditional calendars didn't disappear. They couldn't. People don't abandon traditions just because a government office tells them the seasons have new numbers. Time is personal, emotional, ritualistic, And for many cultures, the calendar wasn't just a tool, it was a reflection of their identity. This is especially true in the Eastern Orthodox world. Countries like Russia, Serbia, Georgia, and parts of the Balkans continued using the Julian calendar for religious observances. Long after their civil governments switched to Gregorian dates, the shift created two parallel rhythms, one for the official world that handled paperwork and trains, and another for the spiritual world that handled holidays and fasts. Imagine waking up in the early 1900s as an Orthodox Christian in Russia. You might hear that the government says it's February 1st. Then you go to church and the priest gently reminds you that, ecclesiastically speaking, it's actually January 19th. And the priest isn't wrong. He's following a calendar that had remained untouched for centuries. This double-dating system gave certain years an odd, dreamy feeling. The world outside was moving with modern precision. But inside the church walls, time flowed differently, slower, older, quietly drifting according to a rhythm set. Long before telescopes and train schedules existed, the coexistence of the two calendars didn't frustrate people as much as one might expect. If anything, it created a calm space where tradition and modernization could stand side by side without colliding. For many Orthodox communities, having two calendars became part of the natural order of things. One for the soul, one for the state. Meanwhile, other countries responded differently. Some embraced the Gregorian system completely and left behind all traces of the Julian calendar. Others blended systems in creative ways. Ethiopia, for instance, continues to use its own ancient solar calendar, with its own new year and its own month structure. It runs about 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorian count because of a different calculation of the year of Christ's birth. And yet, Ethiopia also uses the Gregorian calendar for international business. It's a quiet dance between identities to systems. No conflict, then there's the interesting case of the Middle East. Many Islamic countries continued using the Hijri lunar calendar for religious life and adopted the Gregorian calendar for civil administration. This created a split between formal dates on government documents and the lived rhythm of fasting months, feast days, and religious anniversaries, all of which followed the moon's cycle instead of the sun's. None of these systems existed in isolation. They layered over one another, each serving its own purpose. Civil calendars coordinated governments and global interactions. Traditional calendars preserved culture, memory, and ritual. And as the world stepped into the 20th century, these mixed systems became more visible through migration. Families moved across continents, carrying their calendar traditions with them. A household might celebrate Lunar New Year in February, send kids to a school that used Gregorian dates, and organize weddings based on a traditional astrological calendar. The result was a gentle complexity, a world quietly keeping time in multiple ways. But even in places that had fully adopted the Gregorian calendar for both civil and religious life, the old debates continued as a kind of scholarly hobby. Historians, astronomers, and mathematicians kept discussing the flaws of both systems. They debated leap year rules. They proposed improvements. They published papers on alternative methods of keeping time. Most people ignored these proposals. The world had just finished adjusting to one calendar. Nobody wanted to start again. Still, the early 20th century brought a few attempts to simplify the Gregorian calendar. Some reformers proposed new systems that would make every quarter exactly the same length. Others wanted to add a world holiday that didn't belong to any month. Some wanted 13 months of 28 days each, which sounds efficient until you realize nobody wants a 13th month messing up their birthday. Coalitions formed, petitions circulated, committees met, and then quietly dissolved because nobody felt like reorganizing humanity again. Meanwhile, the Julian calendar kept drifting. Every century that passed added another day to the gap between the two systems. By 1900, the difference was 13 days. By 2100, it will be 14. This slow drift shaped the way Orthodox holidays moved across the seasons. Christmas shifting deeper into January, Epiphany following along behind it. Easter sometimes aligning with the Western date, sometimes drifting far away like a sleepy festival wandering off for a stroll, and the drift remains noticeable today. Look up Orthodox Christmas and you'll see it falling on January 7th Gregorian, which is December 25th Julian. The date didn't change. The world just kept moving while the old calendar stayed exactly where it was. All of this created a strange sense of layered time, where history was not just recorded in the past, but lived in the present through calendars. You can stand in a modern city, surrounded by neon signs and digital clocks, and still meet people who celebrate holidays on dates traced directly back to the ancient Roman world. You can open a smartphone calendar app and see Gregorian dates, while religious notifications follow a lunar system far older than anything Rome invented. You can have one birthday on paper and celebrate another, based on an older tradition. Timekeeping became less about one correct system and more about gentle coexistence. But even as these cultural layers developed, the Gregorian calendar's influence strengthened. As telegraphs, trains, radio, and later the internet connected the world, standardized time zones emerged. Coordinated Universal Time (UTC) became essential. Atomic clocks began tracking seconds more accurately than humans had ever imagined. And global events, from scientific conferences to orbital launches, needed precise dates and times that everyone agreed on. In the midst of all this scientific precision, the Gregorian calendar, imperfect but steady, became humanity's shared backbone. Yet the Julian calendar never truly died. It simply slipped into the quieter corners of life, used for religious feasts, cultural festivals, historical dating, and occasionally academic debates where scholars argue over things like equinox drift with the same sleepy passion monks once had in the 1200s. This gentle coexistence is what defines modern timekeeping. Not uniformity, not perfection, just a comfortable balance between the universal and the traditional. We're in the era where the world mostly agreed on the Gregorian calendar, yet the underlying ideas of time were changing more dramatically than at any other point in history. Not because of popes or monarchs, but because of trains, telegraphs, factories, and the relentless arrival of modern technology, because once the world started insisting that trains had to arrive on time, suddenly the question of what time was became a lot more serious than monks arguing about the equinox. This is where the calendar debate merges into the story of modern timekeeping. The long shift from seasonal rhythm to clock rhythm, from regional dates to global precision. Let's ease into that. By the mid-19th century, industrialization had turned time into a commodity. Factories didn't care about feast days or traditional months. They cared about shift schedules. Trains didn't care about which country refused a papal reform. They cared about standardized timetables. Merchants dealing across continents needed predictable dates. News agencies needed synchronized reporting, and scientists needed a unified system that wasn't drifting by minutes each year. It turned out that once humanity built machines that demanded precision, the old romantic chaos of mismatched calendars lost most of its charm. The Gregorian calendar aligned perfectly with that newer, stricter world, not because it was mathematically perfect, but because it was close enough to keep everything running smoothly. And it was familiar enough that people didn't feel like they were abandoning their entire cultural heritage. Still, changing the calendar wasn't enough. The world also needed unified hours, time zones, standard seconds, a shared framework that stretched across continents. And although time zones sound like a modern invention born from flight schedules and smartphone clocks, they actually emerged from the same problem that plagued the calendar. People couldn't agree on what time it was before time zones. Every town kept its own local time based on the sun. Noon was whenever the sun was highest in your particular sky. Great for farmers, terrible for trains. If you had tried to create a train schedule across Europe in the 1700s, you'd probably still be working on it today. By the 1800s, this problem was embarrassing enough that people finally started coordinating. Britain introduced standardized railway time in the 1840s. Other countries followed, and the conversations about what day is it turned into the more urgent what hour is it. This transition actually softened the long-standing calendar divide. Once people accepted standardized clock time, adopting the Gregorian calendar for dates wasn't such a leap. It felt like part of the same process. Stepping into a world where time had to be shared, it helped that scientists were becoming increasingly influential. Astronomers had long known the Julian system was inaccurate, but now their voices carried weight. Observatories were key for navigation and geography. They needed precise records. They needed leap year rules that didn't embarrass them. They needed calendars that didn't drift away from the seasons like a forgetful uncle who keeps missing appointments. By the early 1900s, the weight of scientific consensus made sticking to the Julian calendar feel less like tradition and more like stubbornness. And yet, the holdouts remained, mostly for religious reasons. This is the part of the story where you get a quiet but fascinating tension between state calendars and church calendars. Civil life moved forward with Gregorian precision. Religious life maintained seasonal and liturgical rhythms based on systems older than modern science. This created moments where history felt layered in real time. For example, a Russian factory worker in 1920 might punch in using Gregorian dates, then go home to a family preparing for a religious feast on the Julian date. The two systems coexisted peacefully, one representing industrial order, the other representing spiritual continuity. Or in Greece during the 1920s, the civil calendar changed while the church year remained tied to Julian feasts. People would attend a church service on December 25th, church time, even though the newspaper said it was January 7th. This coexistence didn't confuse people the way historians expect. People adapt. They always do. And for many, having two calendars wasn't a conflict. It was simply life. Meanwhile, scientists continued refining time with a passion that would have baffled the Renaissance reformers once the 20th century rolled in. Humanity invented new ways to measure time with absurd precision. Quartz clocks, atomic clocks, coordinated universal time, leap seconds. Suddenly, we were tracking time so precisely that we were adjusting milliseconds to make sure Earth's rotation didn't get offended. Compared to that level of obsession, arguing about whether a year needed a leap day. Every century or not started to feel quaint, but the Julian-Gregorian divide wasn't quite done causing trouble. It still mattered in historical research. When historians studied medieval documents, they had to adjust for the drift. When they compared events across countries, they had to check whether the dates were OS or NS. When they traced genealogies, they had to interpret birthdays that seemed to jump around the month. Even today, some events are famously done. The October Revolution in Russia happened on October 25th Julian, which translates to November 7th Gregorian. So the revolution that shaped the 20th century is named after a date that half the world doesn't use. Quietly poetic, in a confusing sort of way. And then there's the cultural side of the debate, which still echoes in surprising places. Modern Orthodox Christians who follow the Julian calendar for feasts maintain dates that slowly drift deeper into the winter season. Christmas on January 7th Gregorian is Christmas on December 25th Julian, and the drift keeps growing. Every century adds one more day. You can imagine a very distant future where Christmas quietly slides into February if the Julian system remains unchanged. It probably won't happen, but the image is oddly calming. The calendar debate also left traces in literature, folklore, and even superstitions. Some regions still refer to Old Christmas or Old New Year, even if most people don't celebrate them anymore. In parts of the Scottish Highlands, Old New Year lingered for decades after the official switch. Cultural habits are slow to fade, but the biggest legacy of the debate is simply the modern world's relationship to time. Before the Gregorian takeover, most people experienced time locally. The seasons told you what mattered. Festivals anchored your sense of the year. Months were reference points, not strict units. But the Gregorian system, paired with modern industry, shifted society toward a regimented time. Schedules, clocks, deadlines, international meetings, financial quarters, school years, and all the orderly rhythms we now take for granted. It wasn't a forced change. It was more like a tide, steady, inevitable, and not particularly interested in whether people enjoyed it. The Gregorian calendar became the backbone of global coordination, quietly arranging life from behind the scenes. And because it runs smoothly enough, most people never think about how long it took to get here.